So the next item on the agenda is the state and local racial and identity profiling policies and accountability subcommittee update and board discussion. Co-chairs are Andrea Guerrero and Warren Stanley, and I see that Warren is here. So Warren, that is it's all up to you.
Thank you. No, turn it up. Is it working? There it is. Well, good morning. Andrea Guerrero, my co-chair on the committee, she couldn't be here. Our committee is tasked with taking a look at racial and identity profiling policies and accountabilities among all the law enforcement agencies here in the state of California. And with that, review and analyze racial and identity profiling policies and practices. And to get started on that, one of the things that we decided to do, like the subcommittee taking a look at civilian complaints, is we sent out a survey to the 425 law enforcement agencies here in the state of California. And our numbers were very similar to what the Civilian Complaint Committee got back. They got back about 114 responses from the various agencies. We got about the same number. And in our second subcommittee, we spent a lot of time going over those results, and I want to thank Shannon and the staff from DOJ. You guys did a wonderful job of putting this survey together and getting it out to the law enforcement agencies, and getting the responses back and putting it together, and then incorporating it into the report. And we asked a number of questions of the law enforcement agencies about their racial and identity profiling practices, procedures, training that they provided. And I'll just go over a couple of the questions, not all of them. But one of the questions we asked, does your agency have a specific policy concerning racial and identity profiling? Does your agency have its own racial and identity profiling training, or do you use the Commission on Post training model? Does your agency conduct any cultural diversity training? Does your agency address biased policing or racial identity profiling in its policies or training in some of the following areas, like reasonable suspicion, initiating stops, searches, and uses of force? So it was a number of questions. Like I said, the 425 agencies, we got 114 responses back. We got some very, very good information. One of the things that we did find out, and it was the same thing that Sahar mentioned, a number of agencies, law enforcement agencies, they use policy provided by Lexipol, and I think we had about, of the 118 that provided responses, I think there was 70 or 75 got their policies from Lexipol, so the numbers were about the same. So based on that, we provided some initial information to go into the report, and we're continuing to refine it. And we also had some recommendations. I won't go into detail on them because they're in the report on pages 31 through 37. But one of the recommendations that we are going to push forward is that at some point, we think it's very important that we as a subcommittee and maybe this board reach out to those other agencies that didn't provide us responses to the survey, reach out to them again and try and get their information so that we can better validate the information that we already have. And that's my report.
Okay, does any board members have any comments on the report? Hearing none, there are only 2 members of the subcommittee present, so should be an easy vote.
Yeah, recommend that we approve the minutes.
There's a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Those minutes are approved.
All right. I believe that I will be our last and final subcommittee update. Our subcommittee was on post-training and recruitment. The other members, we certainly do have several other members, or well, maybe only one other member who's here right now, Judge Lytle and myself. But I'll give a quick update and then also, as we open it up for some board discussion, certainly encourage the judge to chime in and other board members to be asking questions. We had a very vigorous, discussion around the dynamics of the post-training. What AB 953 mandates is that there would be training provided for law enforcement agencies, particularly around racial profiling, and then also, obviously training and support for them to think about how they implement the use of actually, training on how to collect the data, et cetera, et cetera. We had a lot of discussion. Post joined us with a very large team. We're thankful for Post and getting on the call with us. There were several members from Post that came on and really provided a lot of information for us around the work that they had already been doing. There was a current training that Post had created called Bias-Based Policing. I think it's 2.0. Bias-Based Policing 2.0 or maybe 1.0, I'm not sure. But they provided a training for us that they had been using, that they offered up to us as not being one that was perfect or ready, but one that they felt was most closely aligned with what AB 953 would be calling for with respect to training officers around bias and around racial profiling. Obviously, not training officers to racially profile, but training them around the impacts, implications of racial profiling and how not to do so. One of the things that came as a part of our process was introducing a subject matter expert into our committee. We felt, both as committee members and the DOJ, that we wanted to get some support in thinking about some of the training that had been provided, before in other different settings. And so we had a retired Lieutenant Sandra Brown, who's done work with the Fair and Impartial Policing, who sat in there. She is. She's given the Miss America hand wave. And so she came in and provided some expertise around us thinking and analyzing the bias-based policing module that Post had put forward to think about where the areas in which it was meeting both our standards and aspirations, and some areas where we felt like it could grow a little bit. So she certainly has provided some analysis around that. That's also found in the report. We had a lot of discussion around that with Post, and they kind of continued to tell us what it is that they were trying to do. We continued to kind of hold up some things that we really wanted to be focused on. Some of the key questions as part of the conversation that came out was both community and some of us board members really trying to get a sense of, how folks were required to participate with Post or not. It came out in our meeting that law enforcement agencies don't have to be a member of Post. Post stands for Peace Officer Standards and Training, which is a statewide nonprofit, I believe, that provides support around training and support for law enforcement agencies, so that law enforcement agencies don't have to be a part of Post. But I believe there was only about 20 to 25 agencies that Mr. Brown told us don't participate in Post, whereas 600 agencies or so do. So the lion's share of agencies are participating with them. We had a lot of discussion around really trying to get the sense of how could we ensure that whatever training was provided for officers would be consistent across the board, so that there wouldn't be one level of training that was happening in one area of the state that would be far different from another. There was also concerns that some of us had with the bias-based policing tool that was currently being offered up as a tool to think about, that in some elements of the training, there were some board members that really felt that there was certain dynamics in the training that seemed to justify, through some of the comments that were being made, to either justify bias as it being a positive tool and being able to do policing, which a lot of us disagreed with, and then also it lacking, as Judge was kind of pointing out, that it was really lacking kind of a narrative and a background to help folks understand this dynamic of bias. Parts of the training we felt were a little much too focused on this idea that everybody has bias and not focused enough in recognizing that those that volunteer to take up a vocation of policing put themselves at a different level of accountability, obviously have a different level of power, different level of responsibility. We felt that needed to be pushed out more and more. So more as the conversation went on, one of the things that really came up very strongly was an existing tool that Post also has called principled policing, that many, as you know, some folks were knowledgeable of it. You know, full discretion, both myself and Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, who are board members, did work with the Department of Justice on creating that tool back in 2015, I believe it was. But there was, you know, also some kind of feedback from community and others who were knowledgeable about the principal policing because it had, you know, in some cities already been implemented, that there was some thought that that could be a tool that more appropriately is responsive to what the statute mandates in terms of training police officers around racial profiling. Some of the other things that were noted was community members feeling like the principal policing, which actively includes community members in some of the best practices to train their local police officers, that could be a plus in terms of improving community police relationships while at the same time being responsive to what was happening around being responsive to the statute. Also, one of the things that was raised, and I thought it was an important point that we just have to hold on to, is this sense of Member Robinson had raised that if we're going to be talking about you know, this kind of training, we also need to make sure that we're holding the conversation about funding and resourcing for law enforcement agencies. If we're going to ask them to add more training, we need to make sure, you know, I just want to make sure we bring in his voice that he was saying, where is the funding going to be coming for around that? So that was, we had a pretty, you know, kind of strong discussion around that. We actually did not touch on as much as I think we need to, and it certainly, we feel, should be a point of major discussion next year, is on the component of recruitment. We spent a lot of time talking about training, not as much time talking about recruitment, although Judge did push into some notions early on to try to get a sense of us thinking about, you know, how officers are entering to the academy. Are they applying specifically to different agencies? Are they going through other vehicles to be trained so that they ultimately can apply for jobs around that? Our hope is, as a subcommittee, we'll double down on the recruitment dynamic, understand that more deeply. But we very much so around the training felt like it's very crucial and important for the implementation that we want to do to ensure that the right training is implemented for law enforcement agencies. And you know, because the principal policing has already been created, it's been tested both at CHP and other groups that have been working with it, we really wanted to see how, you know, we could, you know, build more education and figure out, you know, both for board members and for the DOJ, how we could look at that principal policing and ensure it's an adequate tool that we can put forward, you know, to ensure that it's implemented across the board and across the state to have some continuity. So that was kind of the summation of what we talked about. You'll see in some of the notes, Sandra Brown also, you know, gives a lot more of the detail around what's missing in the bias-based policing, and I believe her comments also support what some of our conversation was around the implementation of principal policing. So I'll pause there and maybe open it up for other board members. I don't know if the judge has anything that she would like to contribute.
Well, I think you've covered the issue of recruitment very well. I would only add that it's obvious that we can't include in this initial report anything about recruitment, but we can start now to, one, study the issue, get more information about recruitment, and make certain that it's included in next year's study. And I'd be more than willing to kind of be the point person on that. I also would like very much to learn more about this entity, Lexipol. It's mentioned numerous times in the report, and it sounds like a very knowledgeable entity. It certainly is being relied upon by law enforcement for assistance in this area. So I'd like but I don't want, I know I can Google it and I'll get their public relations stuff, but I really want to know more than that. So I'd be willing to work with staff and Post or whoever to get more information.
Other questions, comments on the post-training recruitment subcommittee?
I just have a comment, and I know I'm just going to say the same thing that Sheriff Robinson said, but as we meet with Post pretty consistently, the large law enforcement organizations in the state, it's a big issue for us. As more mandated training develops, the funding for Post really needs to be evaluated. And I think this board could have a voice in ensuring that those folks, legislators and the governor who provide that funding, understand that we're going to make recommendations, that if you really want those recommendations to come to fruition, it has to be properly resourced. Because just stating the problem without providing the resource, I don't think is going to have the effect we need. And one last comment on recruitment, I'm really glad the subcommittee is bringing that up, and needs to be at the forefront, because recruitment is a challenge throughout the state, throughout the nation. But it's not about just recruitment, it's about recruiting the right people to enter this profession. So I think continued dialogue by this board on that issue, because if you hire the right people at the beginning, you're probably less likely to have all of these problems at the end.
And so now that I'm not actually giving the subcommittee report, I'll make some of my own remarks. I think to the co-chair's point around recruitment, I also think it's important for us to really do some analysis next year around some of the barriers that exist around being able to actually bring into public safety the people who are actually from certain communities to provide protection for their communities. You know, there was a conversation I was having with a certain law enforcement agency across the state, and when I sat down with them, he took me to this wall before we sat down and showed me this picture of a lot of white faces and said, you know, Ben, this is the issue, you know, I need you to help us with. We got to figure out how we get more people of color involved. And so when I asked, well, what were the two main issues that are hampering your recruitment? And he said, well, you've got to have, you know, A1 credit, you know, you got to have great credit in order to become a law enforcement, you know, officer, and you can't have a felony, or if you've got people in your family that might have felonies or are too closely connected to some of these issues, that also will disqualify you. And I said, well, you know, respectfully, for folks who have grown up in an under-resourced community, for many of us who feel has been the subject of systemic and structural racism over the course of time that has caused people to be lacking resources, and then guilt by association of family members who have been victims of the enactment of the drug war, you know, one could argue that this within itself is another expression of structural racism to keep people of color out of being in certain positions to provide public safety in their own community. So I think it's an important conversation that we need to have, and also I just would say, not as a subcommittee report person, but just speaking on behalf of people that I'm constantly listening to. I hear, you know, co-chair's remark around funding, and certainly board member Robinson's remark around funding. I think there also is another conversation we can have around how do we divest some of the resources that are currently involved with our local police departments that are focused on equipment that a lot of us in our communities don't want to see in our communities, resources that are you know, consistently used to hire more police officers, and figure out how some of those resources can be properly invested in the training. We might have some of the resources that we already need. Just think it's important for us as a board to continue to think about how we're challenging our law enforcement agencies to use those resources in a way that are informed by community interests and not just the public safety apparatus. Any other comments or questions from board members?
Just one comment about the post-training and the potential and possibility of larger law enforcement organizations compared to smaller law enforcement agencies across the state, may having variations of exposure to training and to enlightenment that comes along with that, the more advanced exposures of officers. And the disadvantage that citizens may be at. And for as much as that is to be said, perhaps law enforcement officers also, who may be coming from a smaller, from a less economically empowered agency as compared to the other one. And how could we envision some sort of a standard across the state so that everybody's exposed at the same level So it's equity on top from law enforcement and equity on top within the community also.
Yeah, that's a good point. Obviously, that's the point where Post provides that reimbursement training. But it's not just providing the training, the cost of the training. Many times, especially when you're from a small law enforcement agency, that person has to be gone if it's not held locally. They need to have backfill to have the prop shifts covered and all those things. So it's very complex in terms of ensuring, as we mandate training, that we provide the resources to allow agencies of all size. Large agencies, although you could argue whether they have more or less resources, can often host that training locally at their own organizations, thus saving some of those costs. Smaller agencies just don't have the infrastructure to do that. So that's something we should discuss.
Yeah, one of the big points of discussion also was around that. And what we continued to push, one another to think about was resources are obviously a real discussion. It causes some of us some great concern when we're talking about resources and we're really talking about people's lives at the same time. That if we don't get, to your point, Pastor Boyd, if we don't get folks the right training, then some of us in our communities are looking at losing loved ones because of not getting the right training. So it is a conversation that, from my understanding from listening to Post, that certain agencies, if they don't have capacity, one of the reasons they created a DVD tool was to try to figure out how to get the information in its most concentrated presentation in front of officers with the most continuity. We still feel, and I know we could make that DVD available for folks that want to view that, we still feel that it's missing the mark. And so whether it's us creating a new tool that still is something that can be used without a live presenter, that might need to be a point of discussion. As much as we can, we feel like we need to figure out how to get adequate, powerful trainers and speakers in front of all of our law enforcement agencies because our lives are worth that much. All right. Yes, Judge.
I agree with all the comments made, particularly with regard to recruitment. I would just like to kind of restate a point I made much earlier, at an earlier meeting, that is. I think that in the matter of recruitment, it won't get us very far if we don't raise our standards for the kind of people we want to be in law enforcement. We have to establish standards and criteria for these people that require excellence. They can't just be mediocre. It can't be Joe Schmo. You've got to recruit excellence, because this has got to be one of the hardest jobs in the world. And not everybody can do it. And that's the only point I wanted to make. We can't work within the current parameters for recruitment. We simply can't. We're not going to get anywhere if we do.
All right. I don't see any other comments or questions from any other board members. So, Judge, I think it's just you and I. So I make a motion that the minutes be accepted as read. All in favor say aye. Aye. Oppose? Abstentions? The judge and I have passed it. All right. All right. Well, feels like we've kind of gotten through all of our subcommittee updates. Now we want to come back to public comment. So again, this microphone here in the center is open. We're asking folks to keep your comments concise to about 3 minutes so that we can get the most comments in as possible, and someone will give you a sign as your time expires. Go ahead and open this up now for public comment.
I hope more come, but I'm going to be real quick so I don't run out of my time. First of all, I'm really concerned, back to the survey that went out, that 73% had non-respondents, and for something that was that is as crucial as this is, as a community member, I need to know how to read that. What should I think of that? That's 73% chose not to respond? Is it that they're not concerned, they don't intend to do it? I don't know what to make of it. That's one point. The second thing, moving to the training. Change is difficult for everybody. And almost no one really changes unless pressure is applied. And I think it's proven that first opportunity, once you lift off that pressure, you change back to where you were. So with the training, I'm concerned about any training that comes in a video mode, because I think people tune out. They don't want to change. They don't want to see it anyway. I had opportunity to sit in on one of the trainings recently, but it was the principal policing training. It was phenomenal. It was number 4, the one that speaks about history and what have you. And I sat in a room full of, I think they were detectives. I don't think they were brand new officers. They were kind of hardened, and it felt like in the room that they were made to be there, didn't want to, clearly. And though it was expertly delivered, I had to sit in the back because I was told up front, of course, you're just an observer. And while they Googled the presenter and they made snide comments and they weren't at all leaned into the conversation, but only because of the expertise of the one that was doing the training did they eventually coddle and get them to participate in it. And it was almost, and from my perspective, I left kind of grieved, because the history is the history. And it was from their own local framing that the information was presented. And there was great resistance to just being able to say, I see how that could be. Great training. And so now if we take a different training, whatever it is, and put it on a video for people to look at, I have no doubt that they're going to be doing whatever they're doing, filling out reports, not paying attention to it. Resources have to be found. For sure, and if we resource the wrong training for whatever reason, it's still not going to do any good. And so I think the training is crucial. I think the community should be involved. I think we need expert trainers to deliver it, someone that's going to push past whatever the experience is and the hardened looks and stares and refusals to pay attention, because it is just that important. So I'm hoping that we find resources, move resources, so that when it's time to train, that we're giving it our best shot, so that people can see where they do need to make a change and make the adjustment. Thank you.
I'd just like to make a comment on the survey. I helped try to distribute that survey throughout the state through the Chiefs Association, and I know Sheriff Robinson did it with his association. We did have a really quick turnaround on the survey. We actually did extend it. I think if we had a little more time, the purpose was to get at least some information to the subcommittees. In the future, I agree, as we move forward with surveys, have a little more timeline and get much greater participation throughout the state.
Yes, I too, it's the surveys, and so I'm glad that you said that. My mindset goes around, well, it's a couple of things. One, when law enforcement gets behind you and turns those lights on and tell you to pull over, we don't have a choice whether we get to pull over or not, because, they're law enforcement. And so if I send you paperwork and I'm asking you for information, you're law enforcement. The example that I'm expecting you to set is the one that you want me to follow. And so if the advisory board is needing information because there was a bill that was passed saying that we need to get this information done and this is what we need, then I'm sitting here as a community person and I'm thinking, no, there has to be some way then to enforce that. It shouldn't, to me, be an option because it's pertinent, it's really important. And then I'm concerned in regard to consistency across the state. For example, how do we know, for one, the consistency in people being able to actually make a complaint across the state for the different law enforcement in different cities. For Stockton, we're able to make a complaint in a specific kind of way, but if it's not consistent, then how do you know that those complaints are actually even being looked into? How are we able to grasp that information? Thanks, sweetie. So that's one, is the consistency. And plus also being able to, when you do the surveys, being consistent across the board, looking at that and just kind of saying, being able to really gather that information. This then would be inconsistent to me because it only has 114 out of 425. And so that really doesn't give us anything to really measure it by.
So just to respond about the complaints, that was an issue that we grappled with as well. It would need a legislative fix for there to be a uniform complaint procedure across all law enforcement agencies, and that's something that we're discussing, whether it makes sense to recommend. But that's the same issue that I personally grappled with and a lot of the subcommittees, that the data has very limited utility if we don't know how these forms are accessible at all, if people are discouraged from making forms. And the research that we've done and what we've heard from communities is that sometimes people are discouraged at the outset, and then there's also these agencies that are doing it very, very well. So that's an issue that we'll continue to look at.
If I could just add something also about the issue of the survey, as I want to follow up. As I recall, before we were concerned about timing, and we were thinking of not doing the survey at all for this first report in light of the fact that we thought it may not be enough time to do a broader survey as we would like. But we decided to move forward anyway with David, as I recall, our understanding is hopefully having, continue efforts and the open opportunities for us to further survey responses from all.
Good afternoon, Rosa Cabrera with Policy Link. First, just want to thank the AG's office for the incredible amount of work that was done on the report. I think it's definitely a lot of very helpful information, particularly for folks who are not that familiar with AB 953. I think it has a lot of good detailed information. Just a couple points of feedback. One is that while I think it's great that a lot of the conversation about the utility of data is centered on why it's helpful for law enforcement, which obviously we want it to be utilized as a tool. I think it would also be helpful to have a section in the report that details how the data can be helpful for community. A lot of the information is going to be centered on what it looks like in local communities in terms of these kinds of profiling practices. And so if there are best practices across the country and other places where it shows how community can also utilize this kind of data as a way to hold local law enforcement accountable and to bubble up to develop effective statewide policies, I think that would be really helpful, particularly given, again, the genesis of why we initiated this policy in the first place. And then just the other point is the report reads a little bit like we're trying to continue to convince law enforcement that this is necessary. And I think it might be worth exploring kind of shifting the tone just a little bit, because I think I would hope that we all believe that it's necessary and that it's less about convincing anyone that we need to collect the data, and it's more about how we effectively collect it so that we can actually start to develop policy and systems change that will ultimately eradicate profiling altogether.
Thank you. Peter Biebring from the ACLU. Very briefly, wanted to echo Ms. Cabrera's comments and the thanks to the DOJ and the board for the extraordinary work that's gone into this report and how thorough it is, especially given the timeline. I do think we may have some more detailed comments, which I won't try to jam into 3 minutes, but we'll try to provide in written form in a timely fashion. But in terms of overall approach, I did want to echo the importance of the community component and having sections of the report that are useful to the community. I think that the evidence-based practices already has the training for community members, that hopefully that can be something that is, especially by next year, something that's really more developed and makes this a tool for community to understand policing as well. And I heard Reverend McBride earlier talk about placing the legislation and this effort in a broader context of why we got to this place where this legislation was necessary, was passed. And I think that's also a good place to explore and elaborate on the community's perspective on this. So, thank you.
And just an update on that, the part that is missing from the draft is the history component that we talked about earlier, which will be very responsive to creating not just the historical in terms of last 300 to 400 years, of this country, and 50, 60 years of some of the images that some of us remember more, but even the more recent times and what we've been experiencing even over the last 10 to 20 years that have really spawned a lot of this work that Ms. Rosa Cabrera has been leading, along with Assemblymember Shirley Weber, who were the two main folks really responsible on the ground and both in the House of making sure AB 953 passed. We'll be making sure that narrative story, the impact of people, will be in the report.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to Stockton. I really wanted to congratulate the Honorable Alice Lytle for your comment about recruiting excellence, because if we put excellence in, then we get excellence coming back out. I've heard a lot of comments about the surveys and the training component. As a member of the community, I just have a very basic question about the videos that are used inside of the post-training. Is there a way for just regular lay people to access for evaluative purposes those training videos? Because maybe what you're missing is our input into what it looks like for us. If we're getting officers that are disengaged because that video is being shown, maybe there is something that we can lend in terms of what we're seeing. But is there a way for us to access any of those videos that are being shown inside Post?
That's actually probably that's a Post question, so we're looking to the Post bench over there, Mr. Rapp.
Hey, Post. Hi.
Recuperating from Thanksgiving also. So, 2 points. One, the majority of the training content on law enforcement specific, meaning that we don't want it really healthy for us to put this out in the public, that they could use in a way against these officers. So that would be a very poor choice in most cases, not all, in most cases. Secondly, and I think more importantly, whenever we create content that's used, we use subject matter experts. And we use everyday folks. We use psychologists. We use folks at ACLU, NAACP, you name it. They're part of the group. Psychologists, clinical analysts, they're part of the content group. So to answer your question, we do use folks from the community, subject matter experts, in that particular topic field to help us craft that.
And not to get in a back and forth, but to do a little bit of back and forth. The minute that you say subject matter experts, you have removed them from the category of everyday folks. And then when you say that we can't really allow the public to access this information because it could be used against us, then I'm going to bring Judge Lytle's comment about recruiting excellence. And if we are not putting excellence into that product, we're not going to get excellence at the end result. There is a lot that you can put into a 5-minute video that can provoke thought, action, reflection, inspiration, but it can also cement and solidify the very concepts that are causing us to lose lives out here. And so if we don't figure out a way to get everyday folk who don't have the degrees, who aren't the subject matter experts, but who are the subjects of the matter at hand, we're going to continue to have this problem.
Well, I think, thank you. Are you finished with your comment?
I am. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Thank you. No, I just didn't want to interrupt you. The one thing I will say as from the subcommittee of those that worked on the training is thank you for your comment. And it has been talked about consistently about how do we leverage the participation and the voice of more community members, not after the cake is already baked, but actually getting in the kitchen when the ingredients are still on the table. And I think that is a part of a process that we're trying to figure out how we develop that and be responsive to that in partnership with Post. I know some of the work that some of us have done with Post. My experience has been is that there is some appetite for that. And I think we want to figure out from this board how we push that even more, because we do believe there is a expertise in the community of those who've been impacted that isn't necessarily taught in school. Judge?
I just wondered quickly. Are they legally protected against public dissemination? I mean, like if I shared it with my niece, who's a professor at UCLA, for her comments, would I be in trouble? And that's DOJ's legal opinion with respect to these tapes? By the way, I don't want to do or say anything that would endanger the safety and lives of law enforcement, but I'd really like to explore this a little further.
Yeah, I just want to separate the two different issues here, because I think they need some significant separation. When we're talking about tactical training, officer safety, those kind of things, that's one level that certainly needs a high degree of control. Specifically, even some of our policies, you know that they're redacted because it could put an officer's life at risk. That is separate than being able to provide information on how law enforcement is engaging diverse communities and trying to establish relationships and trust. That is probably less protected and needs to be less protected because it needs to be as transparent as possible. So some of those two things are a little bit different. And that's, at least from my view, is in law enforcement, they're separate issues.
Thank you, Chief. That was the exact point I was going to make. And I think Post also makes that distinction, at least in some cases. One of the racial profiling videos Post actually showed at a public meeting of this board a couple of meetings ago, and I believe that the archived footage of that is available to the public on the website. So it's not that sort of officer safety tactical information, but it's the exact type of training that we're talking about today. Post showed it at a public meeting. That video, I believe, is, and it's also used in the principal policing course, but that's available. It was shown here. It's available in the archived footage on the website. So some of that information is public, and as the Reverend said, I think there's a continuing conversation between this board and Post about making sure there's community involvement and input and an ability to be transparent with information whenever it's possible and appropriate to do so. I think it's important to separate. Not everything's the same. We shouldn't treat it the same.
Yeah, and just one more note on that. With the principal policing training that we, the subcommittee members were really pushing to be used as the training that can be responsive to this statute, it has been co-created both with local law enforcement agencies and community members in Oakland, in San Jose, in Santa Monica. I'm not absolutely sure about Stockton. I'm looking at Scott, but I think so. Right. So it's happened in several cities before of having community members actually creating some of the training. I just think it's some good push on us as a board to think about how we make sure we represent and be responsive to those interests. Thank you for putting that forward. Any other public comment? Yes, sir.
Most of the time, well, we're here to engender as much change as we possibly can to help to decrease and hopefully at some point to eliminate the statistical damages we have seen to our communities by the death of community member after community member at the hands of law enforcement. And I think we all agree that we can get beyond this with proper training, with the implementation of what we have done in the exercise of our duties and our responsibilities with this board, as well as what the Assembly looks for in the bill. Change comes, hopefully for us, in a very beneficial way, so that our communities can benefit from it. Change that is met by resistance is not good change. It's not good attempt to change. It's not good management of resources. If we who are all in this together can somehow or another embrace the necessary change, realizing that we are all going to be in a better place in the future, in the days ahead, if we embrace the necessity of that change. Case in point, the film that was shown, training film that was shown, exposed to some, I being a person who did not get a chance to see it. If I'm correct, it had reference to the 1965 Edmund Pettus Bridge crossing. That wasn't it. Well, the one thing that raised a concern in my mind is how matters like these that are perceived in the communities as being a bit wrong, inhumane, and not really right, can be mitigated by way of helping the community to come to the same point where law enforcement is, and where law enforcement can come to the same place where community members are. The implicit bias, I think, that happens on both sides can be gotten over, but it will be easier to get over it with the embrace of necessary change. So if comments like the one that we heard earlier, where there could be a sensitivity on the part of law enforcement officers in pre as well as post training, I think would be good for all of us. But they need to hear more often the feelings and the sentiment of members of the broader community in that. And the broader community needs to have the confidence, whether it's the revelation of tools and efforts that are being used in that training, or whether it's information that should be available to everybody. These matters need to be addressed, and I think all of us on both sides would feel a bit more comfortable at the point when that happens.
I'm Magnus Lofstrom of the Public Policy Institute of California. I'm here with my colleague Brandon Martin, and I just want to take this opportunity to let the board know about some research that we are launching that I think is both relevant to your efforts and it might be helpful as well. We are launching a project that is looking at racial disparity in arrests, and part of the goal of this is for us to better understand how these things have changed over time with significant criminal justice reforms that have been passed here in California. If we've seen improvement, where have we seen improvement? What are those conditions of where we have racial disparity now? Where are lessons that we can learn? Understanding the importance of contextualizing these information that is similar to what the board and what this legislation will be collecting in these data collecting efforts. So we're going to be doing that, and I wanted to offer any help that we can possibly provide in your efforts to this transformation and helping the ease of sharing that information with the public, as it's it will be rich. We look at it as being a tool that will help us in our research as well. And I also wanted to stress the kind of the importance and the need for the data to be publicly available to researchers to get the maximum benefit of the data that are being collected. So appreciate all your efforts, and thanks for this opportunity. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Pastor Curtis Smith, pastor here in Stockton, California, and also one of the directors for Faith in San Joaquin, part of Faith in the Valley. A couple things that come to mind as I listen is the words consistency, transparency, and accountability. One of the things there that was lifted up as far as the consistency being important overall is that we are able to measure, because I know what happens in our own town. And apparently, I should say from the comments that was mentioned earlier about, where's the community, in this, is that we continue to make this about what's best for the law enforcement, what's more healthier for the law enforcement, is that what's best for our community members. I say so the consistency in allowing them to be a part, and that our community knows that they are resources and they're not objects. They're not things that we create things for, but that we're creating them with in order that they have a voice. A lot of times it's hard to get them into spaces like here, or even to get up to make the comment, is because they don't believe that their comments are actually being taken into consideration. And so we can continue to have a consistency in that, and actually that we hear you, but also that we're utilizing the information that you're giving to us, and when also consistency across the state, I say of California. I don't know about you, but the anxiety that I feel, and it's happened here in my city for me, where they've turned around, made a U-turn, and then followed me for a certain distance, and I even taken routes just to see if they were following me, and then, then they will turn off. But I also know, too, that there's other areas when I leave my city, there's other areas that I'm more cautious about because of the reputation of that place. So when we're talking about consistency around the board, the training that they go through is that no matter what city you're in California, it would be great that everyone has the same effective training. And also, I say the part about accountability is the integrity of the data that is going to be collected. How are we going to be able to measure that? One comment that was made from Policy Link about, just about I'm sorry, I can't even get it, my head's not going right here. But the accountability, the integrity of the data is basically the biased view, is what I want to say. Is that also, will they, the data that's being collected, how will we know? Will there be a way to, basically collaborate it with what's on the video from the body cams, also with what they're reporting, because I see it's a lot of perception of what they perceive someone to be, and so, and I believe this is win-win, even as we push this forward, that it is done in excellence, as we talk about, just excellence overall, and that the transparency is important, because we keep talking about building trust between law enforcement and community. It keeps coming back to that. And the trust is only going to be built if we don't have situations that continue to happen that show trust is actually being broken, because someone is always being, judged by the color, of their skin, or what zip code that they stay in. And then the basis and foundation of it all in this season that we're looking, and this is history, that we're talking about. The bias is there because the whole system was based upon bias when it was created. As Reverend Ben said, that's going to be in the report about the history. So history is still repeating itself. So I say win-win, because whether, those that don't believe it's important are going to either see that it's not because of the data, or those that would know that it's been happening to us are going to actually understand, and you'll be able to see that it really is important because it has been happening for years and years. And so I just wanted to lift that up. Consistency, accountability, and transparency is definitely what we need.
Thank you.
I think
Good afternoon. My name is Manny Alvarez. I'm from Post. I just wanted to add a couple of clarifying comments to a couple of things that were said today. So in terms of the principled policing training that is 8 hours, that is available to any agency, small or large. They can travel. That is fully funded. There's training going on across the state. So if there's a small agency that wants to participate in that training, they can definitely go and be reimbursed for that. In terms of Post and using subject matter experts to your question, ma'am, we know that our success is obtaining a wide swath of views and opinions on what training should be. We definitely strive to do that. I know there's significant reporting in the draft report on the bias-based policing. That is something we are redoing right now. I think we've reached out, at least to you, Judge, to be a participant in that process. We will have a number of folks, just like yourself, Judge, that will help us produce that. In terms of our other training, to give you an idea, we just finished redoing all the workbooks for the academies. It was a two-step process. We just finished it 2 weeks ago. In that process, we included LULAC, we included the NAACP, immigration rights attorneys, Museum of Tolerance, to rewrite all of those workbooks to make sure that we're inclusive and it's not just a law enforcement view. We know we have more to work on in that regard, but that's what we strive to do. In terms of the video that was shown at the, I think the second to last RIPA board meeting, it is a did you know video. It is not a training video. It's a 2 to 3 minute video, and the purpose of those videos are not necessarily to train, but to create dialogue amongst the people that see it. We encourage it to be used at roll call. We showed it at the RIPA board meeting, and it created dialogue. There is no question about it, and that is the intent of it. It's not to teach, but it's to create dialogue. So if any of you would like to participate in any of the post videos or training, please, our door is always open. We encourage a wide swath of views. So thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to go back to a previous issue, which I promised not to beat to death. Chief Brown, I wonder if it would be acceptable to you if before I share any of the videos or other recorded information that's made available to me, I pass it through counsel at DOJ on the understanding that whatever entity or person I give it to will not thereafter share it. Do you have any problem with that?
Judge, I don't think that's really necessary. I think in these cases, they're busy already. You can just give me a call or an email and ask me if you could, do something, and I can give you permission for that. In the case of that particular DVD that you're talking about, and thinking about the content, I don't believe that there's any officer safety issues on that.
I don't think so either, but I just wanted to be certain.
Right. So I think you'd be fine sharing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, just one last note I want to say. Appreciate that update from Post. And we could take this offline. I mean, the one question that has still kind of remained was we know that law enforcement agencies can access Post for the implementing the principal policing training. I think that the way in which we're talking about it in this context is about it being used explicitly to be responsive to the statute of AB 953, rather than it just being if you want to take it, you take it, rather than it being you're going to take it and you're going to implement this in your department. So I know there's been there was some discussion I know we had on the call around whether that was, I remember some pushback or some questions maybe from Post around whether the principal policing training was the appropriate tool for that. And so maybe, we can table it for another part of our ongoing discussion. There's several community members that have both participated with it, seen its implementation, experienced some of the impact of it, read Dr. Eberhard of Stanford's report around the impact of the training. So we just want to make sure how we move from it being offered as a resource to actually being the tool that's used in relationship to the statute of AB 953.
Great. Are there any other public comments? Next, we're going to move on to approval of next steps. So for the list of next steps that I have so far, and I'd ask the board members to please contribute in this, is one, the co-chairs will be finishing up the historical context for the report as part of our responsibilities. We'll also be doing a video and a joint letter on that point, after today's meeting, we will be doing videos here. I'm asking if any of the board members are interested. It's certainly not required, and I don't think we need all the board members. If you are interested, please stay and coordinate with me and Reverend McBride, and we'll get those done today. Also, next steps also as a board was given about a 1-week turnaround to get your comments to Shannon about the report. So 1 week is a short period of time, so please make every effort to do that. Additionally, there's the art that possibly could be on the cover of the report is displayed. I set them out the table there. If you have comments on those or other suggestions, please also share that with the DOJ staff. And Mr. McBride, do you have anything else on the action items?
No, I don't.
Board members, is there anything that we missed? Let's follow up action item steps. Next steps, the DOJ staff.
Final comments?
And just, I wanted to make a quick announcement to the board members that I will be rotating off the board next year. I will be appointing a new position. The current incoming president of the California Police Chiefs, David Swing, who's the chief in Morgan Hill. So he will be a good replacement. I see some heads nodding, which is good. He's I think will be a good replacement. Certainly not as good as me, but you know, what else? So with that, do I have a motion to adjourn? Nobody wants to go home? Is a motion to adjourn?
We need a board member to give a motion to adjourn.
Okay, motions first and second. I think it unanimous. Everyone have a great day. Board members, if you're interested in participating, please stand by.